folks, Marco here. I'm really happy to spend a few minutes here with Andy Root, Dr. Andrew Root, who is, I've told many people, Andy, that I think you're uh, the number two living brain in youth ministry. And I only put you after Kenda. So,
Yeah, sure.
so that's my esteeming of you. And many of you know, Andy's written a bunch of really important books, and really anything that he has written. In fact, even some outside of the youth ministry world. Your book on children of divorce was so helpful for me as somebody who's not experienced that to understand. It's not a youth ministry book but for me to understand what the kids that I'm working with are really going through. And like, I still remember how you talked about it as an ontological crisis, and that was new learning for me.
Mhm.
So really helpful. I recommend revisiting relational youth ministry, which is an older book of yours, but I
Yeah,
recommend it in every single one of my coaching groups.
cool.
And just was talking to an awesome Catholic youth worker yesterday, just getting an update on his life. And he mentioned that
Mm.
that book was the one book that stuck out for him.
Oh,
So
cool. Thanks,
anyhow,
man.
you're a professor at Luther
Yep,
Seminary, right? In the Twin
yep.
Cities with some kind of weird title
Yeah,
to your,
yeah. Yeah, it's, one of those, well, I'm very thankful that there's a donor behind it, so I'm in an endowed chair called the Carrie
yes,
Olson Balson, Professor of Youth and Family Ministries, so,
that's
neat.
awesome.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, Andy was kind enough to participate with us in this book we have coming out in a matter of days called Youth Ministry in This Season of Disruption. And when I started thinking about the book, I knew I wanted it to be kind of at the crossroads of sparking ideas, but also encouragement, because so many youth workers have been in this deep place of discouragement. And I knew that Andy would help with that in word of encouragement. So asked him to write a chapter that I was calling a theological encouragement. He called it something else, which you can read when you read the book. I should tell you, Andy, funny side, I skimmed your piece when you first sent it to me, and
Yeah.
the words looking forward had jumped out to me. So for much of the edit process, I had it tentatively titled Looking Forward. And then when I was going through it one more time before I handed it off to the editor, I realized, oh, that's exactly the opposite of what he's saying. So I renamed it Here and Now, I think, or something like that. Yes.
That's nice. Yeah, I like that.
Yeah. Okay. So you made a really funny observation just in the first few sentences of the chapter about how when you were naming your most recent book, The End of Youth Ministry, you hadn't expected the title to be prophetic. And I cracked up when I read that. And now we all know who's to blame.
Right.
Um, but separate for us, what's the difference between this current disruption and what you were writing about in your book?
Yeah, because, I mean, I'm talking to a guy who publishes books. You title things long before
Yeah.
stuff happens. So I think like the pandemic started obviously like second week of March, and the book released like end of March, early April. And so when the book came out, like no one was doing youth ministry anymore, or that actually isn't true. No one was doing youth groups gathering in
Yeah.
person anymore, and
Yeah.
so. Yeah, so it felt like, my gosh, the marketing people at Baker were just like, they were looking into their crystal ball and figured this out. But I think what I was trying to get at in the book as the end of youth ministry is, first of all, to be like completely frank, it's a major clickbait title of that book.
Uh-huh.
You
Yeah.
and it was never the working title. And they wanted to just call it the end of youth ministry. And I was the one, my great contribution was the question mark. And really self-serving because then no one can get mad at me. You know what I mean? What do you mean it's the end of youth ministry? Well, it's a question mark, so it's open. Maybe it isn't. Maybe it isn't. So, but really, what I think the book is getting at, which I think is paralleled with the pandemic too, is that I just think it's kind of the end of the youth group.
Mm,
uh,
mhm.
in trying to draw a divide between thinking of the youth pastor or the youth worker as the curator of the youth group. And
Mm.
the more kind of vibrant or more young people who are in the youth group, the better you're doing. I would try in the book to really show like, man, the youth group is kind of in peril. That doesn't mean youth ministry is, and actually youth ministry
Uh-huh.
is reinventing itself, but there are some pretty significant reasons that the youth group isn't kind of functioning the same way that it may have in the
Yeah.
90s, maybe early 2000s, but that we're in a kind of different period. And so, and I think that does kind of connect with the pandemic in the sense, and where kind of my chapter went, was that one of the reasons that the youth group, I think, has in some sense lost some of the vitality that it had is because parents are actually better than they've ever been. I mean,
Mm,
it
mhm.
depends on how you define that, but they're more invested than they've ever been.
Yeah.
So when you allow the youth group to become a thing amongst other things like basketball, like
Mhm.
drama, like chess club, that
Mhm.
the youth ministry gets pushed down on the schedule compared to all
Yeah.
those things.
Yeah.
And so part of the push of the book is to say, let's not think of youth ministry just as the youth group. And this is a time to kind of reinvent that. But what happens in the pandemic, of course, which I think was such an existential crisis for a lot of parents, let alone kids, was all of a sudden all those things, all those activities ended. And they ended
Yeah.
like with one email.
Right.
You'd worked all year for your senior baseball season, and all of a sudden, your parents had driven you around, your dad cared about it,
Yeah.
it's the only thing you and
Yeah.
your dad talked, all these things were going on. You as a parent felt like I'm a good parent because I'm really helping my kid learn what it's like to be on a team, and they're really advancing this, and all of a sudden one email and it's over,
Yeah.
and I think
Yeah.
that became a real crisis. And so in the book is trying to kind of get at how we think of youth ministry inside a time where parents are more invested in getting their kids involved in things.
Mm.
And the chapter is really trying to point at what happens when all the things stop, and what does that actually do to the sense of the good life, really,
Yeah.
for middle class parents,
So
and it
would
becomes a
you
struggle.
maybe suggest then that the pandemic is an expediter on that, an accelerator on that reality?
I think so. I mean, it's just so hard to know what's going to happen at all.
Sure.
You know what I mean?
Right.
But I just know I think across Protestantism, I would say at least, that whether it's being voiced or not, pastors and youth workers, I think, are kind of just holding their breath.
Mm.
I've been thinking about this, and I'm not sure it's true. Somebody could do a better historical analysis, but this probably is the longest period in the history of the church that the faithful, those who do come to church, have not participated, in a lot of churches.
Yeah.
Like, this has been the longest hiatus on actually gathering week by week.
Mhm.
And I think a lot of denominational leaders and a lot of senior pastors and a lot of youth pastors just wonder what's going to happen when we can gather again. And will people just kind of go, you know what? I don't want to ever go back. I don't know why we went in the
Uh-huh.
first place. Like the
Yeah.
small percentage of people who still want to go, what's going to happen there? So it could be most definitely, I think, could be an accelerator to the fact that you can't equate in a kind of one for one that the youth ministry equals the youth group,
Mm.
uh,
Mhm.
and that the
Mhm.
youth group, just as I think the whole congregation and participation of the whole congregation may find itself in a struggle when we reopen the doors, if we can
Yeah.
reopen it. I think the youth group will have that function too, possibly.
Mm.
And so, I mean, I think that'll become a challenge of how we think about what we do and what's our identity,
Yeah.
and what does it mean to do youth ministry. It can't be equated one for one with doing a youth group. I think there'll always be some kind of youth groupy kind of thing,
Uh-huh.
but is that if you were naming the kind of the genus of the animal of youth ministry, usually like one of the descriptions of it is like it's a youth group. And
Uh-huh.
I think that can change, and I think actually we're in a cultural moment where it should.
Yeah. Okay. That's good. So uh in the intro that I wrote for our book, um, which I'm guessing you haven't read,
I've
I
read it three
suggest
times and memorized most of it. I could feel the judgment in your voice. You're like, which
no,
I'm assuming you have
no.
not read.
The only reason you would have is if you looked when you were reviewing your edits, if you looked
Right.
either
Yeah,
direction from
yeah.
each chapter, which I would not have had I been in your shoes. But in there, I suggest my observation is there's been three little mini um, eras,
Yeah.
chapters within this 7 months. And I called them out this way: from mid-March to the end of April, I'm just calling it a chapter of action, because youth workers were scrambling to replicate their current programming online. And it was I was just chatting with some denominational youth leaders a moment ago, and we talked about the difference between innovation and adaptation. That was an adaptation, not an
Mm.
innovation, right? um, but we momentarily felt successful, like
Mhm.
we figured out how to mute all, and we figured out how to live stream. And so I felt this kind of sense of panic followed by a moment of success, a
Mm.
very brief moment,
Mhm.
because then the next little mini stage was like late April through the end of the summer, was just this season of discouragement with
Mhm.
across the board. I've never in my 40 years seen any moment when the tribe of youth workers was so universally discouraged, and it was for obvious reasons. Everybody saw decreased engagement and this gap between what they were called to do and what they were able to do. And then this is the part I want to ask you about. I feel like since kind of early August and into the fall, there's been this season of innovation. And of course, some of it's tiny and won't stick, but some of it's a bigger deal and will have long-term implications, I think. And it's this combination of a forced attempt to try new things, knowing we can't go back to what we tried last spring. And then maybe the biggest factor is a host organization, churches, permission to risk. Because
Mm.
normally, the pragmatism of youth workers is met with the organizational
Mhm.
expectations that act as a barrier to that, and those have been removed, right?
Yeah.
So I guess my question, thoughts on that? Have you seen this, or do you think I'm being overly optimistic about this current stage being one of accelerated innovation?
No, I think it's it's interesting, and I think you're right. I think that you're right on with it. It'll be interesting to see how it plays out, because I
Hmm.
wonder, and this is just a complete hypothetical, but I wonder if we're going to see actually youth ministries and youth workers doing more of the innovation, the new stuff on this end, while we're
Yeah.
finding, and it'll be interesting to see how that gets franchised, how it gets resourced, how it gets seen as value with senior pastors and others. Because my sense with pastors who I've been spending a lot of time with is they're still kind of in the discouragement part,
Uh-huh.
and there's some innovation. There actually is some innovation. The more I think about it, but it's a kind of a releasing of a lot of old forms that get them back into just being with people, even if it's like distance people. Like I know a pastor who, the big church with the $1 million organ hasn't been played in months, but they have like a pizza oven in the back of the church, and people have been coming and sitting on the lawn distance and eating pizza, and it's renewed his own ministry. You know what I mean? So
Uh,
things
uh,
like that can definitely happen. But I also just am really aware that like pastors Christmas is coming,
yeah.
and people are already pissed about the fact that they may not be able to sing on Christmas or
Yeah.
even be together on Christmas. So that
Yeah.
does give a space for the youth ministry that has a little bit more of a latitude to try some of these innovative things, and has a little bit more cover from some of the direct, like
Mm,
you're not gonna mess with my Christmas Eve
right.
service. And so I
Yeah.
think youth workers have to go into this both really risking and going for that.
Yeah.
Also being sensitive that their senior pastor could be under the Christmas tyranny or whatever. People could be turning on her, and kind of balance those things. But I think it will become a necessary. I mean, we're just not going back to normal.
Right.
I mean, hopefully we're going back to being in the same room and being able to have conferences and get on airplanes and things like that. But there's just no way that, it's going to be March 10th again, 2020, where
Yeah.
it's just not going to happen. So their innovation is change is going to have to occur within
Yeah.
that. So I think you're right. And I think we do have to say, and not to pull a muscle patting ourselves on the back, but youth ministry people have historically been the most innovative folks within Protestantism.
Mm-hmm.
And I think sometimes overlooked, but I think that they'll lead again in this necessary, demanded kind of
Yeah.
new thing that's going to come.
So what cautions would you give to youth workers as they attempt new things this fall?
Yeah, I mean, the one I think real temptation of the necessity for innovation, and even our talk of innovation, is that innovation does have inherent within it certain goods, certain senses that make it good. And it particularly kind of comes filtering down to us from Silicon Valley. And
Mm.
that good is the faster the better. The more disruptive, the faster, the better. So it's always
Uh-huh.
about acceleration and going faster and faster and faster and
Yeah.
faster. And one of the potential goods, very limited good things that maybe happened out of the pandemic, is it forced us to slow down.
Uh,
It
uh,
forced us to, as you've titled my chapter, be in the here and now. And
uh-huh.
so I think as we move forward and have to do these new things and get really creative, there also has to be a disposition of not entering into the absolute accelerated pace where we feel like we got to do more and more and more and more and more. I think what
Mm.
the great innovation might be here is how do we actually gather with young people and wait for God to move? This is a
Mm.
time, even as a whole society, we have to wait. I mean, we could go multiple directions with this, but we're in a kind of culture war because we feel like we don't have a good way of waiting. Some people are like, screw waiting, and the other people are like, if you don't wait, you're a terrible person. Well, if you do
Yeah.
wait, you're a terrible person. And we're fighting it as opposed to thinking about a richer way. Does it mean to
Huh.
even act inside of waiting?
Yeah.
And so there's going to be
Huh.
I need a spiritual maturity that both says, let's act. We have to do some new things, but it
Yeah.
also is dependent on us being human with each other
Yeah.
and not just racing for
Mm.
change's sake, but what does it actually mean to inhabit a life lived well with each other?
Mm.
And so I think that that's the danger, is that you're gonna have a bunch of new things you want to do, but how does it help you as a human being be a human being with others? And how does it all allow us all to kind of move into the way of um, the God who has become human for us in
Mm.
Jesus Christ, and reflect that?
I think you've just answered my last question also, which is what encouragement would you give to youth workers right now? But if you want to answer it again or in any other way.
I mean, yeah, I would absolutely echo what I've just said, and that my encouragement is just to be. There is a little bit of
Mm.
a release here to actually just be. And so be with young people and be with parents, however, in the adapted ways you have to, or the innovative ways you have
Mm.
to. But be with them, but also, be with God, and allow God to be with you. And that can be enough. And I think
Mm.
sometimes we're kind of indoctrinated into thinking that there's always needs to be more, and
Mm.
sometimes there's just enough, and that is abundance. And so breathe.
Mm. I'm just realizing that I really wish I had had the foresight. The book that we did together is at the printer now, but I wish I'd had the foresight to name your chapter "Here and Now" with a question mark. Nobody else would have gotten it, but you would have gotten
We would
it.
have laughed really hard. Yes.
Awesome. Andy, thanks so much for your time.
Yeah, it's been great. Thanks, Marco.
Have a good one.